Hello again, and welcome back to Eucharistic Encounters. My name is Matthew Petrusek. I'm the Senior Director of the Word on Fire Institute. This is a series of conversations we have with the Word on Fire Institute professors and fellows and friends, and I am so happy to be in studio with Dr. Tod Worner. Dr. Tod Worner is the Managing Editor of Evangelization Culture Online, the print journal that you get 4 times a year. He's also the host of the Evangelization and Culture Podcast, and he's also a medical doctor at the same time, a full-time medical doctor, and it will never cease to amaze me every time I introduce him that I say those three things are all accurate. That's what he does, those 3 things at the same time. Dr. Tod Worner, welcome to Eucharistic Encounters.
Matt, thank you. It's so great to be here.
All right, so the purpose of this conversation is really to get personal about your own relationship with the Eucharist, but I like to set the table by trying to get some kind of basic understanding of not only how you understand the Eucharist personally, but how you would go about describing what the Eucharist is to someone who really doesn't have a category for understanding it.
Yeah.
So let's start there, and that helps us sort of establish a basic definition.
Yeah, I come at the Eucharist from an original Protestant view, a Lutheran I was, where we had the communion, if you will, once a month. I only knew that we were having communion because it just showed up once a month and the service was a little bit longer. I didn't really fully grapple with any of the nuances of the theology behind it and so on. It wasn't until I met my wife, a Catholic, started attending the Catholic Mass and recognized the whole notion of the Eucharist as the source and summit of the Mass. And so just spending time at the Mass and coming to realize that the pinnacle moment, the peak of this entire gathering is this encounter with the body, blood, soul, and divinity of Jesus Christ in the Eucharist, that transformed my entire understanding of what the Eucharist meant. And so I guess if your question is, what's my basic approach, I'd say to somebody who had no familiarity with what the Eucharist was, what I would say is the Catholic Church is a profoundly tactile, palpable, physically, engaging faith that lives in its thin places. It lives the entirety of our life with God, but especially relishes those sacramental moments, those thin places with God. And perhaps one of the greatest thin places, if you will, between earth and heaven is the moment of partaking in the Eucharist, where you're walking up in the church, you're seeing what was once bread and the host, and what was once wine now becoming the body and blood of Christ. It is something that physically you can't quite discern, but mystically it's a profound engagement that transcends all explanation. So my answer to you is not to say, I would explain it by saying I can't explain it, but I kind of just said that. It's a profound engagement with God on a level that is almost beyond description, yet it is as real as you and I sitting together here and now.
I love that. And I want to get more into your own conversion story.
Sure.
You noted that you converted from Lutheranism, but especially for those in our audience who perhaps are cradle Catholics and they've always had access to the Eucharist. Can you give us a sense of how the Eucharist is perceived, maybe not even speaking personally, but within the community that you used to be a part of, the Lutheran community, perhaps more generally the Protestant community? How is the Eucharist understood at that sort of a visceral level? What's the point of it?
Yeah, I mean, the Lutherans, versus as opposed to some of the other Protestants, have a closer apprehension or understanding of the Eucharist as the body and blood of Christ. As similarly what the Catholics do, but there's some nuances of theology that like transubstantiation, consubstantiation, et cetera, that kind of elude me fully. But what I will say is the general gist of a Lutheran apprehension or a Protestant apprehension of the Eucharist is that it is not the source and summit of the Mass. There is no Mass. It's a service. It's not the source and summit of the service. It is an engagement. It's memorial. It's a special moment in the service and so on, but it does not have the true capital M moment that the Catholic Church centers on the Eucharist itself. So I would say the fact that it's offered once a month, at least that was my experience, kind of says to me, well, it was sort of somewhat, I hate to say this, dispensable for several weeks, and then now we're going to do it this week, as opposed to a Mass. There is no Mass without the Eucharist. And so my understanding is, effectively, I'd say this: the Eucharist figures centrally into the Catholic faith, the Catholic Mass, whereas communion itself, the role of the Last Supper, or the body and blood of Christ, does not have that same sacramental centrality to the Protestant faith. If that sort of makes sense.
It totally does. Yeah. Well, as you put it, is that being from the Catholic perspective, it's the source and the summit.
Correct.
Whereas here, it seems it's just sort of located as one among many in a service and not a Mass. I think it's really helpful. Now let's turn to your conversion story. Yeah. How did the Eucharist play out in your conversion story, both in terms of your understanding of it and your engagement with the...
So one of my earliest memories of the Eucharist was being irritated. And my irritation was I was dating this lovely Catholic girl who became my wife. I was going to a small town church in North Dakota, and she whispered to me at Christmas Mass, you probably don't want to take the Eucharist because I'm not sure my mom would want you to do that. And also, it goes to show the church wouldn't necessarily want me to do that either. And I was red hot. I mean, I was piping. Who's the church? Who's her mom? Who's going to come between me and my relationship with God? And this is why I don't like Catholicism, and so on and so forth. And so I was red hot about it. And it was literally from the time I started dating my wife in 1996 to the time of 2010 when I converted. It was a 14-year wrestling match with my wife. Wow. 14 years. 14 years. And that's another 40-hour series for us to talk about. But the long and the short of it is that the notion of my access to the Eucharist, my understanding of the Eucharist, figures centrally in some of my irritation. Now, if I may say this, I broke the rules by going to Mass before I ever became Catholic, and I would go up there and take. It was almost defiant. I would take the host and drink the blood of Christ, and I thought, this is my communing with God, and the church doesn't have anything to say about it, so on and so forth. But when a path led me closer and closer to becoming Catholic, I recognized that what I was doing was wrong, and it was the teaching of Bishop Barron, at that time Father Barron, Benedict XVI, the Church Fathers. So much of what I had read had really kind of helped me to realize this is something profoundly special. And the church is teaching that I'm not in full communion with the church, and as such, I must respectfully remove myself. And that came in the form of RCIA, which is now OCIA, as I said to my wife, I think I'm going to go and kind of explore becoming Catholic, which, by the way, she said very little about. And months into it, I said to her, she was supportive, but she said very little about it. And months later, I said, how come you're not talking? This is momentous. How come you're not talking about me maybe exploring becoming Catholic? She said, I didn't want to trample on new grass. And so she recognized that she could have been kind of in my face and and the long and short, she gave me the grace to kind of have that space. So during RCIA, you are excused from the Mass at the time of the Eucharist, and you exempt yourself from the Eucharist before you become Catholic, and you arrive at the moment on Easter Vigil and take in the Eucharist, and that first moment of true open-hearted conversion after you've gone to reconciliation. And it was one of the most profound moments of my entire life.
So it sounds like you had a kind of, as the way you're describing, like a willful defiance at first. Now, what was the object of that defiance? Was it the priest? Was it the institution of the church?
It was pride in the notion, to my way of thinking, the Catholic Church was so about structure and hierarchy in my early understanding of it, that it was sort of the Pharisees of the Scriptures. That there was a certain haughtiness and a certain ostentation and so on, and it really kind of was getting in the way of Christ and the truth and the teachings and so on and so forth. We should do a seminar if people don't want to hear it, but the long and the short of it is that I was so wrong on so many accounts along the way, that I misunderstood the church and its service as the repository of the faith, as its dispenser of the sacraments, as its protector of that which is holy, protect us from ourselves, and also dispense graces. I was profoundly wrong. It was willfulness. It was, like you said, it was the best word for it. It was pride and willfulness against everything. It was the Church of Tod, not the Church of God, if you will. Right, and that's a lousy church. I would recommend most people, everybody, don't become a member of the Church of Tod. It was a sense that no one gets in the way of my personal relationship with Christ, and in fact, I came to realize that I got in my way with that personal relationship with Christ.
It's fascinating. I'm thinking as you describe this of sort of the more broader theological distinctions between Catholicism and Protestantism, especially along the lines of what's understood as a personal relationship with Jesus. And it occurred to me as you're describing this that while the Eucharist is intensely personal, right? It's the taking of our Lord into our body. You're reminding us that it's mediated through an institution.
Yeah.
And there's no independent access to our Lord.
No. That whole continuity, the notion that this consecration of this host and this wine at this Mass has a continuous relationship to the past, to the institution of the Eucharist at the Last Supper. There's something, to me, it's not just soothing and comforting. It's profoundly historical. It's profoundly theological. And again, in a world of splintering, that ultimately many of those splinters or those sparks get snuffed simply because they lose their fervor, because it was a proud, willful fervor away from the church. The church it's got the goods. It's the real deal. It's the protector of the sacraments, because it is the dispenser of the sacraments, because it humbly accepted the call to do that from Christ himself.
You just got a great Catholic marketing campaign right there. Catholics come home. No, Catholics, we got the goods.
We got the goods.
We got the goods. All right. As you probably know, I'm sure you've heard many conversion stories. Sometimes, in fact, I think in my own experience, oftentimes from Protestantism to Catholicism, there's sort of an intellectual block as well. I can't accept that this is truly, not symbolically, but truly the body and blood of our Lord. Was that the case for you at all? Were there any intellectual blocks?
Yeah, I still grapple with it. I mean, it's how does one reckon with a miracle? There's a great writer, Brian Doyle, who passed away too young, great essayist, Catholic essayist, and he wrote about the rules on the rules for altar boys on this St. John Vianney parish wall in 1964, I think it was. It was like the priest's rules, And one of the things that he said, remember, to the altar boys, remember, you are partaking in a miracle. Now, I was never an altar server. Now, my daughters at our church have been when they were younger. The notion that you're up there, and maybe kids grumble and they got to wear the vestments and so on and so forth. They got to do the candle and bring things and so on. Maybe father's in a bad mood. Who knows? Whatever the case may be. You are partaking in a miracle. That is astounding. And in a world that seems to be bereft of miracles, and yet they're happening, there's a guaranteed miracle happening every Mass, and you get to be a part of that. That's an extraordinary thing. I will also say this: good friends of ours were told us they have a child with special needs, and they had said they as their child with special needs was going through the process of preparation to accept his first Holy Communion. They worried that would he not fully apprehend or comprehend what the Eucharist meant, and would that make it less holy for him, or would it be almost sort of I don't want to say an insult to God, but would it be sort of sacrilegious in some sense because he doesn't fully get it? And the priest lovingly looked at this very well-educated, wonderful couple and said, his understanding of the Eucharist is closer to yours than yours is to God's. That there's this gigantic gap for all of us, the smartest, the most theologically inclined. There's a chasm of miracle here that we won't cross. And yet our goal is not on this side of the grave to cross it. Our goal is to bathe in the wonder of that sacrament. And we can bathe in that with our most challenged, beloved individuals in society and our most brilliant ones. It's available to all of us, but let's bathe in the wonder. As Chesterton would say, let's loll around in the open sea and quit trying to cross it.
That's beautiful. I want to draw now on your experience, your deep experience being a physician, and look at how that relates to your understanding, your relationship with the Eucharist in two senses. The first is you're a scientist, right? You deal in the realm of cause and effect in trying to improve health. How do you understand through that prism the category of miracle itself, and then the miracle of the Eucharist? Are there tools there for you?
So let me make sure I understand correctly. The miracle of, you mean healthcare and providing people healing,
Yes.
or you mean actual like miracle, like where someone gets better and I can't quite explain
Well,
it?
so within from the perspective of a medical doctor, you have to assume a particular view of the world in order to do your job well. So the first question is in order to engage the category of miracle, the reality of miracle, do you have to exit that space as a doctor,
No.
or is there a way to integrate them somehow in such a way that maybe there's even an assistance from your medical understanding of reality?
I have more appreciation for the reality of miracles as a physician than I ever did before, because I have more of an understanding of the limitations of science as a physician than I ever did before. And I think the world of scientism that sees everything as evidence-based and that which is outside of the evidence-based is hogwash is a world that nobody really inhabits except for in a theoretical mindscape, so to speak. And so to my way of thinking, look, the scientific method and the ways by which we hypothesize, we test, we theorize, we firm up, and then we re-hypothesize, and we start our experiments over and over, it's a gift. So it's a beautiful, wonderful gift. It's just a lousy God, because there's so many things theologically, philosophically, and also along the lines of miracles and so on that cannot be boxed in by the scientific method. As I like to say sometimes to my medical students, I say, the scientific method serves its purpose in understanding the things of science, but it doesn't understand necessarily all the things of human nature. A waffle iron makes good waffles, but it's a terrible thing to play tennis with. The scientific method isn't designed to answer the gigantic questions that transcend science. And so what I'd say is that my coming to understand the vast mystery of human nature and the beauty of it, my coming to understand the incredible gifts that we have in extending people's lives with cardiac stents and chemotherapies and statin medications and so on and so forth. It's amazing, but it also has opened up an entire range of the world that is of God that does not really, it cannot be touched by science. It cannot be touched by my fundamental understanding of things. It's just I believe more in God now since I practiced medicine than I ever did before.
So the kinds of people you hear say, well, look, either you're going to be evidence-based and live in the realm of reality, or you're going to be superstitious, you say.
No, it's ridiculous. And here's the thing. One of my friends I'm going to have on the podcast not too long from now, majority of our scientific studies are observational, which means they're hypothesis generating. They're not gold standard randomized double-blind placebo-controlled trials with hard endpoints. Those are very expensive studies, and there's not that many of them. We're making decisions every day in medicine, oftentimes good decisions, on less than optimal evidence, less than optimal science. So the whole point that everything we live by and operate by has some sort of evidence behind it. I'm like, really? Did you make 1,000 decisions today and they're all based on the finest randomized double-blind placebo-controlled trial with hard endpoints? I didn't. I'd say almost none of my decisions today were based on those. They were based on everything from observational trials, yes, some randomized trials, but also gestalt, common sense, gut feel, intuition, faith. It's the faith and reason side. So part of me it's sort of like the moral relativist. There is no such thing as moral relativism. Any moral relativist out there, as soon as they get cut off in traffic, they become an absolutist. And so my whole point is science is wonderful. It doesn't explain all. You want evidence? That's fantastic. You're going to say your entire life is based on evidence at every turn? I'm like, you're kidding yourself. That's not true. There's faith at every turn, and there's reason at every turn. Why are we as a society so determined to amputate one from the other? That's just not the fullest. That's not the fullness of the human experience.
The other angle I want to get at from your understanding of yourself as a doctor is when you hear the words, "This is my body, this is my blood." Those are not abstract words for you. Like I don't see many bodies cut open, right? I hope I don't have to see them. And I rarely see blood.
Yes.
You do.
Yeah.
You do. And so is there any kind of resonance or connection or depth of knowing the intricacies of the body, of knowing the centrality of the blood to the body
Yeah.
that you bring to the encounter with our Lord.
Yeah, it's what is it that Jesus says, about giving your life for your friends. There's no greater love than to give your life for your friends. What does Jesus give us? He gives us everything. I mean, I was reading something from Guardini the other day, and it was the notion that the Old Testament was always us. I mean, not always, but most of the time we were sacrificing animals to God. And then the New Testament comes and God sacrifices himself to us, and not out of worship, but of mercy, out of grace. And that, like you said, that body component, that notion of a crucifixion, the gruesomeness. I mean, just from, and again, anybody who's watched The Passion of the Christ and the scourging and the Via Dolorosa and the ultimate crucifixion, the physical, the ends of agony that Christ goes through, and understanding kind of suffocation because you can't hold your body up, the pain of being held up, whether you're pierced between your radius and your ulna, and your hand is literally hanging there. It's beyond description, and yet it's not a macabre thing when you look at it. It's macabre because human beings did it to our God, but it's twinned with limitless grace because it's to that length our God loved us. And so yes, the notion of and again, that's what I love about the Catholic Church. I love the incense. I love the bells. I love the holy water. I love all of that. And to know that when I'm processing to the front and I'm accepting the body and blood of Christ and I'm ingesting it, you can't be closer to something than when you've ingested it. And this is Christ himself giving his all in all, and I'm putting it in my body to absorb it into my all in all. It's an intimacy that transcends all intimacy. And to me, it's one of it is perhaps the most perfect gift we will see on this side of the grave.
So moving. Let's talk now a little about your experience with adoration. Is that a common practice for you?
I have not gotten to adoration quite as much as I'd like. Whenever I have gone, it's been transformative. I had a patient of mine, lovely gentleman who I became very good friends with. He brought me up to the Jesuit retreat house at De Montreville, and we had lunch with one of the Jesuit legends up there, and it was just extraordinary. And I remember talking to him one day, and he's a very bright, plain, but also plain-spoken kind of man's man. And I said to him, how would you describe your experience with Eucharistic adoration? Because at that time I hadn't had a whole lot of it. And he said, well, sometimes I just sit there and I look at the Lord, and sometimes the Lord's just looking back at me, and that's all there is to it. That you're just sitting there kind of in God's presence. My experience with Eucharistic adoration invariably, it's like time breaks. There's a great poem by Robert Frost, Stopping by Woods on a Snowy Evening. I quote it probably too much, but where this gentleman is riding in the middle of the night with his horse and his all his wares and so on, and he stops in the middle of the night and he's looking at these woods and the snow is falling and the horse is like, what's going on? We got to keep going. He gives his harness bells a shake to ask if there is some mistake. And the gentleman says, the only other sound's the sweep of easy wind and downy flake. And he knows he has miles to go before his sleep and promises to keep. But in that moment, he's not regretting the past or ruminating. He's not obsessing or worrying about the future. He is here now. And that profound moment of intentionality that happens in the presence of our Lord in Eucharistic adoration, it freezes time, but I would like to say it breaks time in half into a profound, unending moment for the moments that disdains the past and disabuses the future and says, abide in me, rest in me, rest your shoulder on mine. And that to me is that's the will of a father.
There's so much there,
right?
I mean, you're making me think that when we're in the presence of our Lord, who is God? His name is I Am.
Yeah,
it's the most even metaphysically alive you can be because you're pure presence. You're in the presence of pure presence.
Right. The being, the notion of being. Think about being, not becoming.
Yeah.
Not having been.
Yeah.
being. You're in the presence of being, and therefore you're invited to practice being, which means in our breakneck world of efficiency and gotta go, to-do list, multitasking, our distracted, anxious age, you're called to be in the presence of being and simply be. And that is countercultural to the nth degree.
Yeah. We're always wrapped up in the next task.
Right?
Or what has been. Are there any practices that you found helpful during adoration, in addition to just being? Is there prayer, reading, writing?
I pray. I mean, first of all, I think kneeling for me, I love that about Catholicism. I never knelt in a church before I was Catholic. And the notion that every Catholic church has a Swivel Kneeler that says this is important enough. And you look around you and you see these older individuals that, boy, they got bad knees. They got bad hips. It's going to take their spouse to help lift them up. Even they, at their wizened age of 85, 90, whatever, they bend forward. Sometimes they just lean forward in their chair, but they get on their knees and they say, there is a miracle that altar server is assisting the priest with. There's a miracle happening here. So when I do adoration, kneeling is again, I like that it hurts a little bit sometimes. I'm getting to the point where it hurts a little bit. I like a little bit of that discomfort because it reminds me that it's offered up, right? I mean, it's worthy of a little bit of discomfort. The second thing is, I again, as a Protestant, I never prayed for the intercession of the saints before. And I now have dozens and dozens of friends that I go to in my prayers over and over again for particular people, for particular issues, and to be immersed in a cloud of witnesses that I can almost imagine them being in that space with me, adoring Christ. It's you just don't feel alone. You feel absolutely and utterly loved. So to my way of thinking, I don't do a ton of reading during adoration. I kneel and I pray, and I just pound out the prayers. And I don't know, what a friend, not to be, kind of going back to the old hymn, but what a friend we have in Jesus, that we can literally just engage in that conversation. And it doesn't have to end, but it can be specifically wholesome and beautiful and poignant in that moment that we're being.
I want to talk just a little bit about how the Eucharist relates to your work as managing editor of the journal and your work on the podcast. Of course, sometimes you're explicitly engaging the theme of the Eucharist. Has it ever happened where you're working on some other theological or philosophical or literary theme, and the Eucharist just sort of appears to you in a very poignant way in the sense of you spot it somewhere you weren't expecting it?
Yeah. Yes, as a matter of fact, just an example. Many people are familiar with the famous line from Flannery OConnor when Flannery OConnor, the Southern Catholic writer, died at 39 from lupus. She was rising star and ends up as a writer of these shocking works of fiction, also her letters, which are extraordinary. And she ends up in this community of very literary and largely atheist-type friends up in New York. And I think she was at a party. She said nothing the whole night. Someone decided to throw her a bone by saying something about, I think, the Eucharist is such a pleasant, symbol, must be very comforting or whatever. And all she says that whole night in front of these people that she obviously probably feels awkward and maybe wants to sort of impress, although that's not Flannery's style. She says, well, if it's a symbol, then to hell with it. And the notion of a person who is looking at their professional career, surrounding themselves with people who can network with them, maybe potentially at risk of being pulled in their direction. Again, Flannery's not the type to be easily influenced. And for her to have one comment that night, and that is the absolute and utter inviolability of the identity of the Eucharist as that being of Christ. To me, that's just a perfect example of let's not water down what our faith is and what we believe in this modern world. That's the kind of thing I'll be writing a piece, and all of a sudden, Flannery's testimony to the authenticity of the Eucharist as Christ would fit perfectly in this particular line. And again, I think we're looking for Christ everywhere, but we can see him every time we go to the Mass. And not just see him, but engage with him. So there are many, many themes in different writings that I'll do, or different conversations in the podcast. But the notion that Christ makes himself manifest as a miracle every time I'm at the Mass and welcomes me with open arms, with proper reconciliation in advance and so on. It's a central part of what I do in the podcast, in the journal, even though I don't talk about it with every circumstance.
And as sort of conclude, what kinds of words of advice, maybe even consolation, you have for perhaps Catholics who want to believe but are struggling to believe in the Eucharist, or maybe even Protestants who are attracted to Catholicism but find it a stumbling block?
Yeah. I thank you for that. That's kind of a good open-ended question, and I want to answer with this. One of the epiphanies that I had, and I think it was a grace that helped me to overcome my own stumbling blocks with the Eucharist, was when I have two daughters, and I think about it with the birth of each of them. But it first dawned on me when I had my first daughter, Annabelle, and when we were in the hospital room, and my wife, was, I don't know, it was maybe the day after we had her, and family starts kind of shuffling in and so on. They want to hold Annabelle, and there's Carrie lying in bed, and she's got her holding in her arms, this miracle, right? And there's my dad, and my dad will sit down on the chair, and he says, can I hold her? And I take Annabelle out of Carrie's hands, and I put her over into my dad's hands. Now, my dad is a father of three. He has other grandkids. He's no unseasoned veteran when it comes to holding a child. And yet, as I'm handing this little miracle of God's and ours to my dad, I'm saying, no, put your arm here, Dad, and just make sure you hold her head, and just make sure her neck doesn't go this way, and just kind of making sure everything's okay, that my baby girl is going to be fine, even in the hands of a man that I love. And it dawned on me that that's the way the church treats the Eucharist. That the church looks at the Eucharist and says to me, when I'm a Protestant without a full understanding of the miracle that the Eucharist is, this is Christ revisiting us. What the church is saying is, it's not that you're not worthy, you're worthy. But this here, this is so precious. So move your arm a little bit, and make sure you're seated well, and make sure you understand how to hold this, and then drink it in, because we want you to take part in this miracle, because we love it and want you to love it the way that we love it. And my understanding of the church's preservation and protection of the Eucharist, and the way that I wanted to preserve and protect my daughter, it made me realize that the limitations the church put on me was out of love, not out of pride or spite or exclusivity. And all I can say is, when I stood at Easter Vigil that night, 14 years after I fell in love with my wife, 14 years after arguing and wrestling with God on this matter, and as the incense was wafting, and the priest was, I don't know what it's called, what's the chasuble or whatever it is that they wave at you, and the incense is rising, and you see through the incense all these people out there, and there's 4 other people that are converting or being welcomed in the church. I came to realize that in this moment, I'm the offering. I am the offering as I'm coming into this church, and in return for my acceding to be an offering, I now get to partake in the Eucharist. The Eucharist I've hungered for while I was in RCIA. The Eucharist I argued against. The Eucharist I didn't fully understand and still don't fully understand. And all I can say is that first taste of the body and the blood of Christ was like a hunger that was satiated in a way I never understood, and a thirst that was slaked in a way I can never comprehend. So all I want to say to people out there, Protestants, Catholics, whatever, is this is a church that loves you so much that it will take the slings and arrows of the culture for whatever reasons, but it invites you to have the truest and fullest encounter with Christ. And that encounter is in its most authentic at Mass, at the Source and Summit, when you take the Eucharist.
Dr. Tod Worner, you reconverted me. What treasures. What treasures. Thank you so much. Thank you.
Thank you for having me.
We'll have you back soon.
Wonderful.
And thank you all for joining us for another Eucharistic Encounters conversation. I want to give a special thanks to our Institute members who are watching. Again, you make all of this possible. Thank you for your support. If you haven't yet joined us, please consider doing so. Just go to institute.wordonfire.org. That's institute.wordonfire.org. God bless you, and we'll see you again soon.